HOA built 35 homes on my land, so I opened the dam and watched it flow. They thought I wouldn't fight back. You won't believe what I'm about to tell you. Picture this. You wake up one peaceful morning, grab your coffee, and step outside to enjoy the view of your land. Land that has been in your family for generations. Land you grew up on, where you learned to fish, hunt, and appreciate nature. It's more than just dirt. It's your family's legacy. But on this particular morning, something felt off. In the distance, I heard the growling of heavy machinery. Confused, I grabbed my binoculars and looked toward the edge of my property. My heart sank. Bulldozers, excavators, and construction crews were swarming my land like ants on a picnic. Trees were being torn down. Dirt was being ripped apart. They weren't even trying to hide it. No warning, no letter, no meeting, nothing. I drove down to confront them, thinking this had to be some mistake. But when I arrived, the foreman looked at me like I was the one trespassing. "Sir, we have permits from the HOA for this expansion. This area is designated for new homes." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Permits from the HOA for my land? I told them they were building on private property, land that legally belonged to me. I showed them my paperwork. They shrugged it off, telling me to take it up with the HOA board. And so I did. I called, I emailed, I showed up at their meetings. Every time they dismissed me, acting like I was some nuisance trying to slow down their progress. They told me if I had a problem, I should get a lawyer and file a case. They knew legal battles would take years. Years I couldn't afford. They thought I would just give up and watch them steal what was mine. But what they didn't know was that they had made a massive mistake. You see, this wasn't just any piece of land. Hidden beneath those newly paved roads and cookie-cutter houses was something crucial, something that had been there long before their fancy suburban plans. Years ago, my grandfather had built a small but powerful dam on this property. It was designed to control the flow of rainwater from the hills during heavy storms. Over time, the area around it became a natural wetland, quietly holding back thousands of gallons of water. When the HOA developers came in, they never bothered to check the old land surveys. They built their homes, streets, and playgrounds right on top of a floodplain that was only one mistake away from turning their dream neighborhood into a disaster zone. And that mistake was messing with me. The secret beneath their streets. Now here's where their arrogance really backfired. You see, decades ago, long before suburban sprawl reached our town, my grandfather had built a small dam on our family's land. It wasn't some giant concrete wall or a massive government project. No, this was a simple yet brilliant design. An old-school dam meant to manage the flow of rainwater that would rush down from the surrounding hills every storm season. Back then, the town was much smaller. The dam helped protect the lower farmlands from flooding, creating a controlled wetland that became a natural reservoir. Over the years, nature blended with the structure. Trees grew around it. Wildlife made it home. It became a quiet, unnoticed part of the landscape, hidden in plain sight. But here's the thing. That dam never stopped working. It still held back a significant volume of water. And most importantly, it was still located entirely on my private property. That piece of land might have looked like an empty field to outsiders, but it was a key part of the area's water management system. Fast forward to when the HOA developers came in with their big dreams of expanding their suburban utopia. They were in such a rush to build their perfectly organized neighborhood that they didn't bother to do a deep dive into the old land records. They skimmed through surface-level surveys, ignored environmental reports, and assumed that because no one had built there before, it was fair game. Big mistake. They paved new roads, dug up the soil, laid foundations, and stacked house after house on top of what was essentially a floodplain waiting to awaken. They built parks, playgrounds, and even installed underground drainage systems. Systems that, ironically, were designed to drain water right into the basin controlled by my dam. When I noticed what was happening, I didn't stay silent. I did everything by the book. I wrote formal letters. I sent emails with maps showing the dam's location and the risk of flooding if its water flow was tampered with. I even hired a lawyer to send cease and desist notices, but their response was always the same. smug, dismissive, and downright insulting. One board member actually laughed in my face and said, "Go ahead and sue us. By the time anything happens in court, we'll have sold out every home here." In their minds, they had me cornered. They figured I wouldn't have the resources to drag them through a long legal battle. They thought I was powerless. But what they failed to understand was that while court cases take years, opening the dam's floodgates takes just a few seconds. The dam wasn't some theoretical threat. It was a real physical structure, fully operational and under my control. They had built their entire development with zero understanding of the land's history, and now they had set up their neighborhood like a row of dominoes teetering on the edge. And me, I was the one holding the key, opening the dam the day everything changed. It was a rainy Tuesday morning when I decided enough was enough. For weeks I had been watching the storm forecasts, knowing exactly how much pressure was building behind that old dam. The local HOA board thought they had outmaneuvered me with their legal loopholes and arrogance, but Mother Nature doesn't care about paperwork, and neither does water. I woke up that morning to the sound of heavy rain pounding against my windows. Streams of runoff from the hills were already making their way into the reservoir, and the water level was rising faster than I had ever seen before. The neighborhood they had illegally built just beyond the ridge sat silent and smug, oblivious to the ticking time bomb lurking beneath their perfectly manicured lawns. I grabbed my raincoat, pulled on my boots, and headed straight for the dam. As I stood there at the dam's old control gate, I could feel the raw power of the water pressing against the aging structure. The metal wheel was rusted, but it still worked just fine. All it needed was a few turns. I looked out over the land, remembering how peaceful it used to be. Now it was covered in concrete driveways and those identical beige homes that had invaded my family's land. No more warnings, no more letters, no more pretending this was going to resolve in some quiet meeting room. With a deep breath, I grabbed the wheel, unlocked the safety latch, and began to turn. The creaking metal echoed through the air, almost as if the dam itself had been waiting for this moment. Then, with a thunderous rush, water exploded through the flood channels. A roaring torrent carved its way downhill, racing straight for the heart of the new development. I didn't have to do anything else. Nature and gravity were now in control. Within minutes, chaos unfolded. The lower streets of the neighborhood became instant rivers. Lawns transformed into muddy swamps. Decorative garden beds were ripped apart by the current. I watched as luxury SUVs and shiny sedans, which had been proudly parked in driveways just hours ago, now floated down cul-de-sacs like bath toys in a flooded tub. And there, standing in the middle of the mess, was the HOA president, the same man who had dismissed every warning I sent him. He was ankle-deep in filthy brown water, frantically barking orders into his phone, trying to control a situation that was far beyond his power. Neighbors were running outside, confused and panicked, as the water continued to rise. Emergency crews hadn't even arrived yet. There was no stopping what had been set in motion. I didn't celebrate, I didn't yell or cheer, but as I stood there watching the water reclaim what was rightfully mine, I felt a deep, cold wave of satisfaction. This wasn't revenge. This was consequence. They had ignored every chance I gave them to fix this the right way. Now the land itself was teaching them a lesson, one they wouldn't forget. When they came running, you can probably imagine what happened next, but trust me, it was even better in person. Within minutes of the floodwaters turning their pristine streets into murky canals, the HOA board members came storming onto my property. Soaked from head to toe, furious and red-faced, they looked like a pack of wet, angry cats. They were shouting over each other, waving their phones in the air and throwing out every threat in the book. "You're going to pay for this. This is criminal sabotage. We're calling the police. You've destroyed private property." One of them, the HOA president, the same man who had arrogantly dismissed every email and letter I sent, pointed his finger in my face, demanding I stop the flooding immediately. As if I could just snap my fingers and reverse the flow of an entire dam. I stood there calm, collected, and holding a large folder of documents. They wanted a fight? Fine, but this time it would be on my terms. Without saying a word, I slowly opened the folder and pulled out a thick stack of papers. The original land surveys clearly marking the dam's boundaries, the permits that showed the structure had been legally built and maintained for decades, and, my personal favorite, printed copies of every single letter, email, and legal notice I had sent them over the past year. I held up the papers and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "This is my land and you built on it illegally." The board members suddenly went quiet. You could see the color drain from their faces as reality hit them. They had no answer. No smart comebacks. Just silence. Because in that moment, they realized they had not only ignored me, they had ignored every legal step required to build on someone else's property. And then, as if things couldn't get worse for them, the city inspectors arrived. They waded through the flooded streets, clipboard in hand, their expressions growing more serious by the second as they reviewed my documents. One of the inspectors looked over at the HOA president and asked, "Where are your land acquisition permits for this development?" The only response was a long, uncomfortable silence. Turns out the HOA had overlooked a few minor details, like filing the proper paperwork to legally acquire my land. They thought they could bulldoze through with influence, money, and sheer arrogance. But now, the weight of their shortcuts was quite literally washing away their multi-million-dollar project. For the first time in this entire battle, the narrative was no longer theirs to control. It was mine, and it didn't stop there. Soon, news vans lined the streets. Drones buzzed overhead, capturing aerial shots of an entire neighborhood submerged under dirty floodwaters. Reporters started piecing together the story. HOA builds on private land, faces legal disaster. And within hours, it was all over social media. The comment sections were brutal. Thousands of people sided with me. The aftermath, owning the narrative. In the weeks that followed, the HOA scrambled to save face. But the truth was undeniable. They had built 35 homes on land they didn't own. The worst part? The recent flooding made their mistake impossible to cover up. Water doesn't care about legal loopholes, and neither did I. For years, the HOA had acted like they owned the world, steamrolling over anyone who dared question them. They thought they could bully, bribe, or bulldoze their way through anything. But this time, they messed with the wrong person. When the floodwater settled and the damage was assessed, the HOA board found themselves backed into a corner. They had two choices: buy the land from me at a price I named, or tear down everything and start over from scratch. Neither option was cheap, but I wasn't in a forgiving mood. Guess which one they chose? Let's just say, my land became very valuable overnight, but I didn't rush to cash in. See, this wasn't just about money, it was about principle. Those families living in those homes, this wasn't their fault. They bought their homes in good faith, trusting that the HOA had done their due diligence. The real culprits were the HOA board members, the ones who thought they could ignore property lines and steamroll over the little guy. Before I agreed to anything, I made sure every family affected was properly compensated. Relocation fees, temporary housing, the works. I wasn't about to let innocent people get caught in the crossfire of the HOA's arrogance. Only when I was satisfied that the families were taken care of did I negotiate the sale of the land. And believe me, I named my price. After all, I held all the cards. They needed my land. I didn't need to sell it. Every day they delayed, legal fees and damages piled up. Every time it rained, the flooding would return as a harsh reminder of their incompetence. As for me, I still own the dam. And now, every time storm clouds gather, the HOA remembers exactly who they're dealing with. They learned the hard way that you can't just build on someone's land and expect to get away with it. Actions have consequences. Sometimes, those consequences come in the form of a neighbor who knows exactly how much leverage a little water can bring. So the next time you hear about a powerful HOA throwing its weight around, remember this story. Sometimes the little guy wins. Sometimes, sweet revenge is served with a flood warning. If you enjoyed this story of sweet revenge, make sure to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments, what would you have done if someone built on your land? More crazy real-life stories coming soon.